Hello, fellow cross connectors. Natalie here with a quick update for you on this July the 2nd. Hey, it is only the second day of July. Have you restarted reading the Psalter? Might want to give that a try. You're only on day 2. If you want to get started, now's the time. I'm here on this lovely Independence Day week to let you know that we are pausing new content on the podcast for this week to give everyone a little break and to allow you to catch up on the Psalms. If you haven't listened in, we had 4 fabulous episodes on the Psalms with 2 absolutely fantastic special guest hosts. And we want to allow you time to get through Job before we release that episode next week. So today we are bringing you a backtrack. This is our episode on the Gospel of Luke. We thought this would be a great one for you to re-listen to this week as we are hearing the Gospel of Luke in the Sunday lectionaries right now. So enjoy this backtrack of the Gospel of Luke. Catch up on the episodes of the Psalms and on your reading of Job, and we will be back with new content for you next week. Enjoy!
Talk about rabbit holes. I think...
We're going to get to Luke again. This is a fun one.
This was supposed to be our overview of Luke, and it's a deep dive on Christology.
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Folks, here we are today with a special bonus episode on the Gospel of Luke.
and you people have been asking for this. Like at the back door of church, I get, when's Luke coming out? When's Luke coming out?
Sorry,
Like,
we're
okay.
behind.
They're coming
on
for our
recording.
kneecaps.
I get it. We're, but here we are. Here's Luke, and we'll get to John soon as well. But today, the Gospel according to Luke. As we love to do. Where did the Gospel of Luke come from? Who's Luke?
So we are pretty sure that Luke is a Gentile. It is in that sense non-Jew. He's not a Jewish person. Christian, non-Jew. As such, he's probably the only author of the New Testament who is not Jewish. Could be the only author of the entire Bible who is not Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty important.
Pretty important. And we can see there's a couple of places where he'll start explaining things that a Jewish audience wouldn't need explained.
So not only is he not Jewish, but he's also not writing to a Jewish audience. He's writing to a different audience.
Remember when Christianity, the church first starts going, it's first going to Jews, right? Like it's the Jews, the church in Jerusalem. And then Paul starts this mission to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world, which is going to be a major theme in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which is written also by Luke.
And written to the same person, Theophilus.
Theophilus. So there's a huge question. It's written almost like a letter. And
Yeah, a little bit like one of the letters of Paul.
Right. Like he's writing this letter, this account of Jesus for this person. Now, Theophilus means lover of God. So Theo, God, Philus, like Philadelphia, lover of God. And so is this some guy from the early church that's named Theophilus that he's writing for? Or is he writing for the lovers of God?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
I like that. I like that too.
That made me feel warm and fuzzy.
Yeah. We think it was written sometime around between like 80 and 90 AD. If you remember, we think that Mark was written around 70 when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And we thought Matthew was written probably around the same time. Like Matthew and Luke are written probably within a few years of each other, two vastly different audiences. I think we said that
Matthew's a very Jewish
is
audience.
the most Jewish of the
you could really
of
hear
the Gospels, and Luke is just the opposite. He's not Jewish. Luke is also, whoever he is, we think he might have been a companion of Paul. Mm-hmm. but he's very educated. His Greek is astoundingly good in a way that the other biblical authors do not have as good of Greek as he does. He also apparently is well-traveled because he knows geography and customs around the world really well. It is interesting. So when he talks about the Sea of Galilee, which we probably all think of the Sea of Galilee, it's in a million stories in the Gospels, he does not call it the Sea of Galilee. He calls it Lake Gennesaret. And part of that reason is because as a well-traveled man, he knew what a sea looked like. And Galilee just didn't fit the bill for what a sea looked like for him. He's like, this is not a sea.
This is an elevated pond.
This is a lake, maybe. He's like, I'll give you a lake. There's some major themes in Luke that set it apart. Remember, the Gospels are each sort of a sermon written by a gospeler for their audience. Or they're not just telling the facts and figures about Jesus, but they're sermonizing about Jesus and who this Jesus is. And for Luke, major theme is universal salvation, that Jesus has come for all people, not just the Jewish people. And you definitely see that in the other Gospels, but Luke emphasizes it in a way that they don't. Remember, if Luke is a Gentile and he's writing for a Gentile audience, why do you think he's highlighting this? Well, it's because it's really important to him and to his followers. Jesus is the Savior for all people. He has a concern to show lots of different kinds of people coming to Jesus. Women, the poor. When we get to the book of Acts, as I say, was also written by Luke. The first person the church baptizes is an Ethiopian eunuch, like the strangest person that he could possibly conjure up in the imagination. He's like, no, this guy can join the family of God too.
Right.
Like, no one is outside of God's grace and mercy. And he has a love for the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is throughout the book. The Holy Spirit is doing lots of stuff with Jesus. And then sometimes the book of Acts is called the Gospel of the Holy Spirit because it's the Spirit that is depicted as just moving through the apostles as they go out and do their ministries.
Yeah.
So
I really liked this book.
Yeah, it's a good one. Just to recap some of what you said, Rick, and to point out some of the things that I think makes Luke unique, as you mentioned, Luke, in a way that you do not find in other Gospels, really prioritizes women. And so the Magnificat comes from Luke, for anyone that didn't realize that, the Song of Mary, right? In chapter 1, verse 46 to 55, Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord," the Magnificat. And it's this beautiful imagery of this great reversal that the Lord is doing where the lowly are raised up, the rich are sent away empty. So, and I think that's another thing I would say. You see this in the Magnificat. Luke has a really strong concern with justice. So it's in Luke as well, right? Luke 4 that
Nazareth inaugural?
Yeah, that Jesus quotes from the scroll of Isaiah about his mission. And this is really Luke's kind of thesis statement for the book. And you mentioned the Spirit, Rick, but this happens in chapter 4, verse 18. Yep. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So again, these are really significant material justice realities for Luke. Again, not that you don't find that in the other Gospels, but it seems to really be a priority.
Highlighted.
The marginalized are really, really significant for Luke. And this is why women play such a significant role. And Gentiles, because Gentiles in this period for Jews were marginalized people. I think the other thing unique about Luke, and you mentioned him being a Gentile, one of the ways this is pretty clear to us is the Lucan genealogy versus the Matthean genealogy. Matthew really is kind of the counterpoint to Luke in a lot of ways. Matthew is a very Jewish gospel, whereas Luke is a very Gentile gospel. And one very concrete way you see this is in Matthew's genealogy, it goes back to Abraham. Abraham is the start of Matthew's genealogy.
And it starts with Abraham and goes
down to Jesus.
Jesus.
Luke's is funny because it starts the reverse way.
Starts with Jesus and then works backwards.
And works backward to Adam.
All the way to Adam.
And again, this is really emphasizing, as you mentioned, Rick, the universal scope of God's work, that this genealogy goes back to a time when Israel did not even exist, right? So definitely a big difference there.
It was also interesting, I thought, the positioning of that genealogy in each of them. In Matthew, it is right up front at the very beginning of the first chapter. In Luke, you don't get Jesus' genealogy until the end of chapter 3, and by then you're all the way up to Jesus' baptism by John.
Yeah.
It's almost, by the way, this is who this person is all the way back.
If I could just go back, something we said, I don't know, 20 episodes ago, if I can just, when we were looking in Genesis, we started with the creation of the world, and then there were these stories that were for all peoples, right? It was the story of the flood, it was the story of the Tower of Babel, all peoples. And then there was a shift, and the story went to Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and it became the story of one family. And we talked about how the focus just went from this grand cosmic scale, God creating all things, down to one family, one people, one nation.
The 70 people who came to
Egypt.
To Egypt from Israel.
From one family that then becomes a nation. And so the whole focus of the Bible before this has been on that family, which turned into a nation. And then, as we saw in 1 Kings, turns into two nations before they both fall. But here, it's right here in Luke where we see that focus shift back to the beginning, where it's not just on one people, one nation, one family. It is all people.
Yeah, it almost explodes back out.
It's exactly right. Yeah, there's this cosmic universal scale in Luke.
Speaking of things we've spoken about before, in our episode about 1 Samuel, we talked about Hannah's song.
Yeah.
And the parallels between Hannah's song and the Magnificat as found here in Luke.
Yep.
Yeah.
Those justice themes. Now, the Magnificat's a bit longer than Hannah's song, but it's got a lot of the same tone.
Mary's song in Luke is very obviously based on Hannah's song.
Absolutely. And it's important to say, we've emphasized this quite a bit of why we are reading the Bible cover to cover. The Old Testament is very important to Luke. I mean, we just named two explicit examples. The Song of Mary, he's absolutely drawing on Hannah's song and is familiar with it. And then Jesus's quotation of Isaiah in chapter 4, right? And you find this throughout Luke's gospel. To Rick's point of him being a very educated author and he writes really well, he is constantly drawing on these previous...
Even as a Gentile. As a Gentile, he would not have grown up with these stories.
Right.
And yet, he couldn't tell the story of Jesus without grounding it in the story of the Old Testament.
Right.
What I love, too, is in that particular spot where in chapter 4 that you mentioned, where he quotes Isaiah, because it's Luke speaking to a Gentile audience, he makes sure to make it clear that Jesus opens the scroll of Isaiah. It's almost as if he's making sure that the audience knows where this quote is coming from.
He's in a synagogue when he does it. So,
absolutely.
If we can just go backwards just a little bit before we get there, because like Matthew, Luke tells the story of Jesus' birth. And actually, Luke's version of the story is far more familiar to us and far more detailed than Matthew's story.
Right.
It's in Luke that we get the shepherds and the angels. It's in Luke that we get the manger. Manger's not even mentioned in Matthew's gospel. And
nor is Elizabeth.
I was going to say, in Luke, you don't even start with Jesus' birth story. It's John's birth story first.
Yep. Which, again, parallels birth stories from the Old Testament, like Abraham and Sarah, where the woman is barren.
It's an old couple.
Yeah, right.
They're barren. And Zechariah has an incredible moment in the Holy of Holies. You may have heard our episode on 1 Kings, where we talked about Solomon's temple, and then there was a Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would have been. It wasn't here in Zechariah. John the Baptist's father would not have seen it because it was lost by then. But he goes into the Holy of Holies, and it's there that he is told that he and Elizabeth are going to have a child. And he doesn't believe the angel when the angel tells him this. And so Zechariah is struck mute. He cannot speak.
And he does not get to speak again until he affirms what his wife says, which is that the child's name will be John.
Yep.
Because
which
that
is strange.
Not common.
It should have been Zechariah. You always name the son after the father, but nope.
We're going to go with what the angel said.
Yeah. One of the other things I love about the early chapters, so we've talked about Mary's song, but there's also the song of Zechariah, which we call the Benedictus Es. There's also the song of Simeon.
Yep.
There's the song of the angels who sing their Glorias. I always say the Gospel of Luke begins like a Broadway musical. Everyone is breaking into song and dance every few verses. It's this like celebration of this new thing that God is doing among us.
What we don't have, right? We don't have the fleeing to Egypt, though.
No, we
That does
we
not happen
have a
in
journey
here.
to Bethlehem.
Right.
We have the journey to Bethlehem because there's going to be a
The
census.
census. We have the census, but not the...
Which we do not get in
the
Matthew.
kings,
Right. There's no, typically, I mean, if you go to an Episcopal church on Christmas Eve, it is Luke's story of Christmas that we hear.
It's a little bit of a mixing of Matthew's and Luke's, because sometimes you'll also get the angel to... It depends on what church you're going to and what they've decided to do with their Christmas pageant.
Well, okay, with their Christmas pageant, of course.
Well,
yeah, you're always
right.
going to get the
Oh, it's
kings
true,
and the
right.
other things.
Yeah,
but
they
like,
get the
but when
whole
the
thing.
gospel's proclaimed on Christmas Eve, it's Luke.
It's the Gospel of Luke.
It's
Right.
Luke.
Yeah.
Right.
In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that
Yep.
all the world shall be registered. Like,
Yep.
you know.
Yeah.
I also just want to mention, again, if you listen to our First Kings episode, people seem to have a real interest in archaeological collaboration, extra biblical collaboration. There is no evidence of this decree that Luke mentions in chapter 2. So just worth mentioning.
Yep.
Make of that what you will. But it is an interesting fun fact.
Well, what it does do is calling the census brings you back to mind of a lot of those Hebrew scriptures. As we saw several times, a census was often called when the king wanted to find out how many warriors he could call upon and send off into battle. And it does get, as we said, the family to Bethlehem of Judah, of the southern kingdom, which is very important.
There's those kingdoms
Originally
again.
in the
Yeah.
Hebrew scriptures. So.
This also what makes Luke unique is this is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the only gospel we get a discussion of Jesus as a boy.
Yeah,
I think it's easy
I
for us to
know.
just think like Jesus was born and then he became a man.
Yeah, right.
Like even
Right.
unconsciously,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I don't
No.
think we explicitly think this, but that is probably how we kind of most imagine in it. And here, there's this awesome story where the boy Jesus went into the temple.
And it's teaching.
And is teaching.
teaching the teachers.
Right, right.
I love
and
it.
there's
It's
this
'cause
really... Go ahead.
Yeah, well, he gets, he's there. His family is left, and
He
they're like,
ditches
"Wait,
his family."
Where did he
Yeah.
go?"
Yep. But there's also this really amazing moment. And again, I think unconscious thoughts we have about Jesus. He was born, he became a man. I think another one is we really, I'm going to presume here, I think unconsciously think of Jesus as very divine, as having this. I almost think we think of him like Superman. He had these just like superhuman abilities. And there is this moment in that section at the end of chapter 2. This is verse 52. It's very, very interesting to consider. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Which if you actually go back to our episode, there's someone that Luke is drawing this language from.
Isn't it David?
I can't remember. That'll have to be for the listener to find out where that is coming from.
Was it Samuel?
I think it was Samuel, and I think
Samuel.
it was...
It was Samuel. That's
I think it
right.
was Samuel. I think this... It
It
looks
was
like...
around the time it would talk about Hannah going and visiting and bringing him the cute little outfits.
Yeah. And he,
Yes,
And
that's
then
exactly
it was,
right.
Yep.
It looks like the note in my study Bible says this exact language comes from 1 Samuel 2:26.
Yep.
Again, very interesting to consider, right? Jesus was very much human.
Yeah.
He was a boy. He grew up.
and he could increase.
And he could increase.
Right. He didn't. He didn't just come fully formed. He had to grow.
This we won't go down a whole theological rabbit hole here, but this raises really interesting questions about what it means for Jesus to be divine, especially given what you said, Rick, about Luke's reliance isn't the right word, but love for the Spirit. That I think in a lot of ways, Luke has this vision of Jesus as empowered by the Spirit.
Yeah.
The
beginning
start
of
of chapter 4,
Yeah,
Jesus,
chapter
full
4.
of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan. And you see this constantly. So that's the beginning of chapter 4. You see it again in verse 14. Then Jesus, filled with the power
Spirit.
of the Spirit, returned to Galilee.
Well, that's right after his baptism.
Yeah.
So
And-
it's almost as if the Spirit comes upon him at the moment of the baptism
Yes.
and then carries forward.
Yep.
He's grown up enough at that point too. Which I think it's important to note that Jesus grew up and could grow in favor and wisdom and all of that, because again, one of the things we say about Jesus all the time is that Jesus knew what it was to be human, fully human.
Yep.
And part of that is growing up.
Yep.
Growing
Yep.
in wisdom, going from not knowing very much to understanding.
Yep.
That is part of the human experience. How can you be human without doing
Yep.
that?
Right.
Yeah.
So almost if Jesus had been born fully formed and not needing to grow into any of that, it's like he would have missed out on part of what it was to be human.
Well, it's funny you say that because this is to some degree exactly what the author of Hebrews says, right? That he was without sin, but he knew, I'm forgetting the exact phraseology, the gist is, Rick, you might remember, he knew every trial and temptation, but yet was without sin. And so I think that's, again, Natalee, a great reminder that according to the author of the book of Hebrews, which some people actually think could have been Luke, again, because most people don't think that, but some people do think that.
We haven't gotten to Hebrews yet.
Part of it has to do with the Greek of Hebrews is very complex as well.
Yep.
But that's just a way to affirm what you're saying, Natalee. It's also interesting, again, not to go down a theological rabbit hole here.
Oh, come on.
But, I
We
can't help
love
myself.
rabbit holes. This is almost like Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, but this is what
Come on, White Rabbit, lead us
the
on.
early church really affirmed as they're trying to make, the Gospels do not present Jesus as, oh, hey, Jesus was fully divine and fully human.
No,
You're not going to find
that language is not in there.
Language is not here. But this is how the early church had to make sense of this person presented in the Gospels, that this is the best way to make sense of what Jesus did, who he was, how he experienced everything we experienced. Like Athanasius will talk about, Jesus cannot fully understand us and die for us if he was not fully human, right? So there's that affirmation. And yet there's the paradoxical other affirmation of he had to also be fully divine to take on this mission that he took on.
Yeah.
I will throw out there for anyone that wants to look it up. There's an interesting conversation. All of this is under the category of this fancy word Christology, quite literally just the study of Christ, right?
Yep.
And there's interesting discussions about a spirit Christology, the idea that the way to understand Jesus's divinity is not some like quality that Jesus had, but through the empowering of the Spirit. And a lot of this comes through Luke. I'll warn people, so I'm not presenting it in a way that isn't honest. A lot of people might not consider this very orthodox,
Right?
But it is just an interesting conversation among theologians. So,
Well, the other conversation is like, when do the gospel authors present Jesus as divine? And, in Mark's gospel, which we think was the first gospel that was written, it really seems to be at his baptism when the Spirit falls on him.
Right.
In Matthew and Luke, it seems to be at his conception and birth, like when Jesus comes into the world.
Right.
And when we get to John's gospel, whenever we get to John's gospel, 8 months from
Soon.
now.
Soon.
Okay,
Soon.
sure. We will see. It's at the beginning of time.
Yep,
Right.
right.
In the beginning was the word.
From the very beginning.
And so there, as the first few centuries of Christianity went on, it's the gospel authors are tracking this, like they're presenting Jesus as divine earlier and earlier. It's like they keep going back.
Right. I also think this came up in our forum recently because we were looking at Isaiah. I think it's also interesting that in Mark, you don't get a virgin birth, and you do get it in Matthew and Luke, right?
Yep.
And what's interesting is they're quoting from Isaiah, but they're actually misquoting Isaiah. And we complimented Luke on his Greek and whatnot, but there actually seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm forgetting the chapter of Isaiah, but it's this
We'll
famous...
get there when we get to Isaiah.
Yeah, there's this famous prophecy of a young woman, is what it says in Isaiah.
Chapter 7?
Maybe it's somewhere early in Isaiah. The reader can look it up at home if you want, or maybe
Or
someone
wait till
will
we
find
get
it
to
here
the
really
book
quick.
of Isaiah.
Or wait till we get to Isaiah. But the point is, there's a famous, what the early Christians and the gospel writers viewed as a messianic prophecy from Isaiah about this young woman who will give birth to this son who will rescue the people. And in the context of Isaiah, it's important to say, most likely this was referencing the king that was going to come, Hezekiah. But they read this and understand, oh, this doesn't fulfill it completely. Jesus fulfills this. Did you find it, Rick?
I did. It's chapter 7 and it's verse 14.
Do you want to read the verse?
Therefore the Lord, he will give you a sign. There a girl is pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a son, and she'll name him Emmanuel, which means God with us.
Right. They misunderstand when it talks about a woman. In the Hebrew, it talks about like a young woman.
Right, girl.
And, a girl, right, as your translation put it. And there's this
Luke translates it as a virgin.
virgin. Yeah, there's this funny
It's
thing.
like the Greek translation, according to the
Yeah.
notes, is for some
In-
reason
in the
Greek
Septuagint.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. It looks, the words are very, very, very similar. And so they read it as virgin.
Yep.
Darn that translation problem where things do not translate over easily.
Yeah, right. And so I won't go into it, but it raises a very interesting historical question, because go listen to all of our Old Testament episodes. We've talked a lot about history. And for example, the Deuteronomistic history's relationship to quote unquote history, capital H, right? Like that this is a theological telling. And it is interesting how we might think of that in relationship to the gospel. Do we believe historically that Jesus had a virginal birth from Mary? Some people are going to feel like this is really, really important to believe. We need to believe that this happened historically. I do think the translation issue raises questions about that and how we understand that. And that part of what may be happening here is there's a theological telling that they felt was really important, because they thought that's what Isaiah had said.
So what do you think Matthew and Luke are saying theologically by saying that he was born by a virgin? What does that theologically
that this is the one that Isaiah prophesied, the one that is coming to bring Israel out of exile, right? Emmanuel, God with us, as we've talked about in so many of our episodes, right? There's even this language of Messiah is the Hebrew word for king. It becomes synonymous. It really literally anointed. And so what they are saying is that Jesus is this king from the line of David who has come to rescue us. And I'm glad you brought this up, Rick. This is true regardless, right? This is true regardless. Right. But there is this funny thing that happens with how they are trying to convey that through Isaiah.
It has to be a pure action of God,
right?
And that we have all these stories in the Bible of unlikely people getting pregnant and having children, and Mary is like that to the nth degree in Matthew and Luke because she hasn't had sex yet,
right?
So this is also interesting to me because. Right. So first of all, you wanted to disconnect from any sins of the father, the human type father, right? So you get rid of the connection to a human father and therefore any of the sins of the flesh of the father.
So I think that comes later.
But, well, I'm just saying, so if it's a virgin, right? So it's straight from God. So you don't have to worry about whatever, in our Hebrew Testaments, there are, because your father did this, or like your father, there's just some of that.
Things fall,
You can pull that out of there. You don't have to worry about that. What I think ends up happening eventually, and I don't recall if it's scriptural, there becomes this, well, then you're still connected to the flesh via Mary. Mm-hmm. And the flesh, all flesh from the beginning of time is subject to sin because of the fall in the garden. And so then you have to concoct a way that Mary
is also sinless.
Right.
And immaculately conceived.
Which
is where Roman Catholics go.
Right. Which is where you end
to solve
up
that
this
problem.
Yeah.
and I think that's
it's like now you're contorting everything.
Yeah.
Because you think that matters to a degree that I'm not sure it matters.
And I think I talk about rabbit holes. I think
we're going to get to Luke again. This is a fun one.
This was supposed to be our overview of Luke, and it's a deep dive on Christology.
The Hebrew Bible doesn't really have does not look at sex and sexual relations as something that is gross and impure.
Right.
Right. Like it just said, so-and-so knew a person. Like they had, like, it just says it. Like there's no moral fault or taint that is put on there.
Sometimes they're with prostitutes,
right?
And they
no
have
problem,
harems
and they move on to the next
that's
thing.
Necessarily an issue,
and it's it's their daughters who get them drunk, and like there's all it is just a fact of life. God is in that, just like God is in everything else. And what happens in Greek philosophy and history is that all of a sudden there becomes like a moral shadow on anything that is sexual.
Yep.
And that's where I think we get the whole, Mary had to be a virgin. She had to be pure.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not how Luke or Matthew write about the virgin birth.
Right.
It's not about, she had to be pure. It's, this is a new act of God. It is a spontaneous thing that didn't require human intervention. It's just God did it without the need to make anything gross or weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important to
So
emphasize.
I think if you told my Catholic friends, my Catholic priest friends might hate me for saying this, but I think if you told Matthew and Luke that one day we're going to come up with the theology of the Immaculate Conception that says that Mary was also,
Right.
Matthew and Luke would be like, what?
Yeah, right.
Like, what are you talking about?
doing? Like,
That's so
what?
strange. Like,
Yeah.
no, it's not what this is about at all.
Yeah.
It's about God doing this thing among us.
Right.
Which is just probably an important way of saying we have these texts, and there is a long history of 2,000 years of people reading these texts
Yeah.
and trying to make sense of them. And it's not to say we can't do that. It's not to say,
Sure.
like we just talked about with Christology, there is an extrapolation of these texts of understanding Jesus as fully human and fully divine. And the early church Christians and theologians felt this was a necessary framework for rightly interpreting what's going on here. So it's really our task today, and it's a fun and exciting task to figure out how do we continue to grapple with these texts in a way that makes sense for our lives and our world.
Yeah.
And we might feel like that means we need to say there was an Immaculate Conception, and we might feel like that's not necessary.
Yeah.
So I think it's always a process of dialogue and discussing this together in community.
And that, I think, Matthew and Luke would be like right on
100%.
with.
Yep.
Like, yes, let's
Right.
do this.
Yep.
Matthew and Luke, who have a conversation in the New Testament where they come at the story of Jesus from different perspectives, one
Yeah.
a Jew, one a Gentile. They would be perfectly happy with us having a
Yep.
Well-
theological and faithful conversation about who Jesus is.
And
Absolutely.
clearly the people who assembled what is our
Yes.
Bible wanted that to happen, or they
Absolutely.
would not have given
They
us.
would have just picked one.
They would have
Yeah,
picked
been
one.
done with it. It'd been so much easier. Oh my
Right.
gosh.
They
I know.
they not only gave us Mark's really short version, but they gave us Matthew and Luke's that are written to two different audiences by two different people
Yeah.
from different perspectives, and then gives us John, which comes out of left field.
Yep.
Yeah, right.
And is beautiful in its own way.
Yep.
They put it all together so that we had this very broad, diverse view
Yeah.
of the story of this person, so that we could,
So
we could
to-
continue to talk about it.
Yeah, to maybe zoom out on that note and maybe just
Back
continue.
to Luke specifically.
Well, yeah, to go back to a 30,000 foot view and to say some of the things that continue to make Luke distinctive and why I'm really glad it's included is Luke has more parables
Yeah.
than any other gospel. Luke he just really likes stories. And I think the one chapter he is perhaps most famous for is certainly chapter 15. Yeah, Rick's got it open right now. These parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son,
lost son.
right? The
Yep.
lost son. So
all right in a row.
we can
Yep.
talk about those. Those are amazing. But before we do, maybe to also just continue to say some things that make Luke unique and interesting. He has, I think, as an Episcopalian, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, the road to Emmaus, where we really get this extended look into what was happening after Jesus' death. And there are these two disciples on the road who encounter Jesus, and they don't recognize him, and
They walk with him for miles.
They walk with him, and like, we had hoped he was the one.
they're walking with Jesus, talking about Jesus,
Yep.
and they don't recognize
And
it's
they don't
Jesus.
recognize him.
until
they break bread and Jesus opens the scriptures with them, right? And so to me, that's an amazing story as an Episcopalian about this liturgical act
Yeah.
of breaking bread together, of sitting around a table together, that Jesus meets us in that moment. So that's another one that I think makes Luke really great. I'm trying to think of any other big picture things about Luke. Those were the big ones I had off the top of my head. But those are unique, right? Because you're not going to
Yep.
find those parables that we referenced in chapter 15 in any other gospel.
It does have the similarities of there's some of the early things that Jesus is doing is, casting out demons. The demons recognize who he is before the people do.
Yeah.
He's doing miracles. He's teaching. He's healing.
Yep.
we should also say from 35,000 foot view that this is one of we call the synoptic gospels. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are
See with.
very similar. They see with the same eye, synoptic.
Yeah.
And so there are things that track across them. They
Right.
share lots of things. John is an outlier. It does not share a lot of things with the synoptics. But
Right.
so there are these things that are the same, but there are these things that make it unique.
Right. And I just remembered I got super excited. I was like jumping in my chair.
I could see you.
I could
was
see
like,
you,
oh
I know.
boy, he's got something else to say.
Well, because I'm just thinking, like, man, what makes Luke
Like,
unique?
what did I trigger?
Like, yes, we have this shared material, and one of the things we talked about to summarize and recap, if you didn't listen to our Mark episode, is part of this synoptic. These three that see with the same eyes is they are likely all drawing on one source, right? So there's this, you can go look this up. This is super nerdy. You can go look up the Q source.
Yeah.
This doesn't exist. We don't physically have access to it. But basically what scholars say is, all of this shared material between Mark, Luke, and Matthew, it must have come from the same place.
Must be a document out
There
There
must
was
be something that was
they
out
all
there.
looked at
Right.
or had heard.
Granted, some scholars will dispute this and
Yep.
and they will think like it just is really Mark, and then Matthew and Luke are maybe drawing on Mark, and maybe they kind of interacted. But regardless, go look that up. Some people call it the Q problem, the source problem. That being said, things that are unique to Luke that I also just remembered is Zacchaeus. Man,
Oh,
that
He's a
one-
wee little man.
that
a wee
one's
little man
so
was
good.
he.
And that's another great story about Luke's specific emphasis on outsiders and marginalized, because Zacchaeus is this tax collector, right? And this is the one that Jesus is like, I have come specifically for you and to eat in your house.
Yep.
So that's just such a good story. And then the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is only in Luke, I believe.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I'm pretty
Yep.
sure.
Wow, I
And
missed
so,
that.
I mean, gosh.
Maybe the greatest of parables.
Yeah, right? Like I'm thinking now, oh my gosh, Zacchaeus, prodigal son, Good Samaritan, like we wouldn't have any of these if it wasn't for Luke.
Yeah.
Luke's kind of a banger.
There's also Lazarus and the rich man.
Lazarus and the rich man.
Which is incredible
Yep.
and gets us
That's
a view
a different
on
Lazarus than the one he raised from
Different
the dead.
Lazarus.
The one who
it's
is in Abraham's bosom.
Yeah, there's a rich man.
But a huge parable against wealth and riches and injustice.
But Luke is very wary at wealth.
Yeah, right. Big time.
And wary of wealthy people.
Yep.
It is a problem for Luke.
Absolutely.
A theological problem.
It is a huge problem. I had a confirmand this year who's been reading the Gospels, and
that's
which is
awesome. I
amazing.
love that.
That's good.
Let me be clear. Most confirmands
Get
they're
him on
not
the
gonna-
podcast.
Yeah. Well, you
Well,
know what?
maybe-
He comes
maybe
up to
when-
me. He comes up to me one day and he goes, Elliot, I've been reading the Gospels, and I think my biggest takeaway, and I was expecting him to just say something like, Jesus wants you to love people, or
Right,
God
yeah, yeah,
loves
yeah.
you. And he goes, my biggest takeaway is Jesus really doesn't like money.
Well,
And I was
Jesus
like-
does have more to say about money and how we use it
anything
than
else.
anything
Yep.
else in the Gospels.
Exactly.
And that may largely be from Luke, but it's not exclusively in Luke.
No, it's not.
And so we should all take a real hard look at that.
And it's also worth mentioning to that point, Natalie, that so Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount, right? And there's the Beatitudes. Everyone knows the Beatitudes. They're
Yeah.
great.
Yep.
Luke's are a little bit different.
And it's not on a mount.
And it's not on a mount. It's on a plane.
It's a sermon on a level place.
right.
Well, now that's interesting because on a mount puts Jesus up high above. On a plane, that's equal standing, equal footing.
Absolutely.
So the mount.
There's a theological difference.
The
there.
mount in Matthew was meant to evoke
Moses. Yeah.
standing on the mountaintop receiving the Ten Commandments. But here Luke is a Gentile. He doesn't need to make a claim that Jesus is a new Moses. That's
Right.
not an issue.
But
So,
he might need to make a claim about a level place.
yeah.
And the other big difference between the two, do you know? You remember what they are? Luke
well-
includes something that Matthew doesn't.
The woes.
The woes. Yeah.
You preached
right.
about the woes, didn't you? Was that you?
I don't think
Or was
so.
that Tanya? That might have been Tanya. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was Tanya. Maybe we can link that in the show notes. I think that was a really good sermon. But this is kind of unique to Luke.
Also in the Luke and
The poor.
Beatitudes. So in Matthew's version, it's blessed are the poor in spirit.
Right.
But in Luke, it's blessed are the poor.
Period.
Like
Yeah.
we're not talking about a spiritual poverty here.
Right.
We're talking about the poor.
Right.
Yep.
Which people have made a really big deal about this. I think it's kind of overblown. I don't think Matthew means it in a spiritual way, but it is still a difference. I think Matthew still has in mind the material poor, absolutely.
Well, then
but-
he goes on. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness."
Righteousness,
And
yeah.
in Luke, it's "Blessed are those who hunger and
Right,
thirst."
right.
So it's like I think there is a little bit of a
No, there is. There definitely is. But it's funny. Rick will know this. Like in theology circles, people make a really big. Yeah, it's like, oh, Matthew's so spiritualized.
hang your hat on that.
Well,
Right.
but what if that's again because of who they're writing to and what they're writing for?
Yeah.
If part of it for Matthew is writing to the Jewish people to really connect Jesus to the foundations and the fathers, but Luke is written to Gentiles and people who act, not that the reasons for following are so different, but the Gentiles don't care about as necessarily the spirit and the righteous. They're caring about practical matters now, and I don't know.
Yeah.
It could just be a little different. That you hear them a little differently from a different place if you're in a different place.
Well, I mean, and don't get me wrong, they are very different. Luke in chapter 6, verse 24, explicitly says, "Woe to you who are rich.
Woe to you who are
for
rich.
you have received your consolation." I mean, there's no beating around the bush here.
Nope.
He's not saying, woe to you who have money but misuse it. He's saying, woe to you who are rich. And that's a hard saying of Jesus in Luke. That's a hard saying. And let me be clear, that's a hard saying for anyone who lives in the Western world with privilege. I'm not even differentiating among classes of people in America. This is a hard saying to hear for those of us who have a lot of material possessions.
You who are full now, for you will be hungry. I mean, even if you're not way up on the socioeconomic ladder, many people in this country, not everyone.
Yep.
I mean, we still have people who are definitely
absolutely
hungry now.
Yep.
But many, many of us at least have that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can just speak for myself. There hasn't been many days I've gone hungry, right?
No.
In the true sense of hunger.
No, it's a privilege to fast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I hear this. Let me be very clear. I'm not just saying this for others. I hear this and I think, oh man, this is hard.
Yeah.
This applies to me as well.
I mean, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man goes to hell, and Lazarus, the poor man, goes to heaven.
Right.
And there's no reason for why Lazarus goes to heaven. It's not like, oh, he was really faithful. He just goes to heaven, and the rich man doesn't. I mean, it is stark.
Where do you know off the top of your head, Rick, where that story
Chapter
is?
16?
Yes, 16, 19 to 31. Let me flip there now, because that is such a unique parable. And I think one thing that's important to say about this parable, I'm not sure how many listeners would be concerned about this. A lot of people focus on this parable, I think, for the wrong reason, to see it as this story about the afterlife.
No, right.
And this is not a story about the afterlife. This is a story about how we treat the poor now. And the purpose of the story is about not mistreating the poor and the needy and those who are suffering and marginalized. So that's probably important just to say for the sake of the listener. But it's, as you pointed out, it's a really interesting story. And isn't there this moment, I'm trying to look at it while I talk, where Lazarus is basically like, can I go back to tell my family?
The rich man.
I mean, the rich man. Sorry.
Rich man first says, "Can you send Lazarus to give me a drink of water?"
Right.
And no, Lazarus is not coming out of heaven to give you a drink of water. And then
ignored him at your gate.
Right. And then he's like, "Can you send him to my brother?"
Yes.
So that he would know.
Yes.
We're not playing Charles Dickens here. This is not.
Yeah. He's like, "Sorry, bud, you missed the train."
Carol.
Well, and do you remember explicitly what Luke says? Doesn't he say, if he hasn't listened to Moses and
the prophets,
they have Moses and the prophets. This is Luke 16,
I remember this.
29. Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them."
Yep.
Boom.
Yep, man.
And then in 31, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead.
Which should be a huge foreshadowing. Right. It's not just because Jesus who's going to rise from the dead, everyone's going to start converting over.
Right. And this actually also explains Luke's context, because this is an issue Paul really has to deal with, and we'll see this when we get to Romans 9 to 11.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler. Sorry, I love spoilers. All of the Bible's connected.
You're talking
so you
my
have to
language
spoil
here.
everything.
Romans 9 to 11. That's at the heart of Romans.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the moment where Paul, and kind of like what I think Luke is doing here, is having to deal with why people are not listening to the message of Jesus. Specifically, not just why people, but why Jews and why Israel.
Yeah.
Because here's this nascent Jewish movement that is saying this is the Messiah. And a lot of people in their midst are like, what are you talking about? No, it's not. And so they have to kind of explain what is going on here. And we'll get to how Paul does this. But that's part of what Luke is doing here, is he's like, oh, you won't even listen to Moses and the prophets. You're not going to listen to someone that resurrects from the dead.
Yeah, because Moses and the prophets say a lot. We've been going through the Hebrew scriptures, and it's a lot of the same sort of stuff. It's already there.
Yeah.
It's just being reinforced now.
Right.
About how to treat people.
Right. Absolutely. How you treat the orphan, the widow, the needy, the poor, the resident alien.
Now.
Yeah.
Right now.
Absolutely.
While you're alive.
Absolutely.
Not later.
So yeah, that's a good one. Anything else about Luke? Rick already talked about Acts, but just to reemphasize, it has a sequel. So that's kind of cool. The only gospel with a sequel.
Only gospel with a sequel.
Part 2, the Holy Spirit's reign.
Is the sequel better than the original, do you think?
It's so different. What do you think?
I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
We're going to get
Spoilers,
there.
yeah.
Spoiler alert.
There's
we
some-
get to that in, I'll find the month.
Speaking of stories, there are some funny stories in Acts.
There
that I'm
really are.
Excited to talk
The
about.
long, boring sermon that Paul gives and
Yeah.
someone falls and breaks his neck.
But gets resurrected.
Yeah, why not? Yep. That's what happens when I give a long, boring sermon.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I didn't.
Luke's a
find it
good
right.
one.
Luke's a good one.
John up next, right?
John's
Yeah.
up next.
All right.
With an epic beginning.
With
Yeah.
an epic beginning.
In the beginning.
And a tabernacle
Yeah.
Ooh.
named Jesus. Can't jump too far ahead.
Not too far ahead, but I think we'll get to John relatively soon because we gotta knock out our gospel, our first time through the gospels.
Yeah.
For folks, I think.
Yeah, we're already back in Matthew at this point.
Yeah, we're already back in
our
Matthew reading.
Personal reading.
Yeah, apologies.
Man, you guys are reading Matthew?
Yeah.
Only if you're sticking to the reading plan.
Hey, I'm just saying, I've heard a lot of people that have said, those gospels, I'm not reading them 4 times.
Yeah, some people.
Someone's got to represent them out
No one
here.
said
I
that to
know,
me.
I
No,
know.
no one's had the temerity to say it to my face. Okay.
Well, we did at least get one person who commented saying that they were not keeping up with the Gospels
Yeah.
because we weren't keeping up with the Gospels.
Yeah.
But we have had a lot of people who are keeping up enough that they were asking for this episode because we're behind.
Yep.
We are here to attempt to serve you all in good time.
Amen.
All right. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot VanHoy.
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.
Not to go down a theological rabbit hole here.
Oh, come on.
But, I can't
We
help
love
myself.
rabbit holes.
This is
This is almost like Alice in Wonderland. Come on, White Rabbit, lead us on.